Now, many years ago in the last century, there was a hit song called Video Killed the Radio Star, and the premise was exactly that. It obviously didn't kill the radio star because some of you are asking, what's a video? Now, and radio is still here, and I suppose it was probably the case when TV first came out as well. Well, that said, technology has really changed the way we consume our content, and radio has to evolve as well. And today we have James Cridland, radio futurologist, an award-winning copywriter, presenter, and internet strategist. He was instrumental in launching the world's first radio smartphone app at Virgin Radio. He's the founder of the Hybrid Radio Technology Association, Radio DNS, and also has worked on the BBC iPlayer for radio. Without further ado, please let me invite James up on stage.
Because otherwise you'll never hear me. Hello. There we are. Somebody who's worked in radio for 27 years and I forgot to grab a microphone. That's a good start, isn't it? Right, hands up any of you who have a smartphone with you today. Yes, I thought that might be the case. Feel free to take any photographs of these and tweet them, but there's a particular slide I would like you to take a photograph of and to tweet, to put on Facebook, to WhatsApp to all your friends a little bit later. As you can see, my name's James Cridland. I call myself a radio futurologist. It turns out if you print your own business cards, you can call yourself anything. I recommend it. Head of gravity, I don't think that one's gone. Head of the sun shining, all of that. Director of air, that's always a good one. This was my first ever radio. I got it when I was 5. I had to eat an awful lot of very sugary breakfast cereal. And I was amazed when I got this radio. I was amazed because I turned it on and there were voices there. And those voices told me what was going on in the world. And I remember listening to it an awful lot in the first day that I got it. And I was very sad in the evening because I realised that I had used my radio up. And I would have to get a new radio with different words in. I didn't appreciate that the words were actually getting broadcast all the way into the radio. But that was my first ever radio, and it got me very hooked into this wonderful medium that I've spent my entire life in. So as you've heard, I've worked in radio for quite some time. That's me up there, looking very young, looking as if I don't really know. Thanks. That's very kind of you. Never had that. Never had that before. Wearing a very nice waistcoat as well, so there you go. Working as an announcer for a radio station in the UK. I then moved, as you've heard, to Virgin Radio, where I did a couple of things. I launched the first daily podcast in the UK for a radio station in March 2005, and also in March 2005, it was a busy month, I launched, as you've heard, the world's first mobile phone app for a radio station. It wasn't called an app because we didn't know that these things were supposed to be called apps, so we called it a 3G tuner. There you go. And in case you wondered what it looked like this. Look at the technology here. So you didn't actually, you had to have a little sort of proddy thing, and you could listen to 3 radio stations on it. The cost of data was so expensive that if you listened to an hour, it will cost you about $22 US. So frankly, you could have gone out and bought a CD, and it would be much the same kind of thing. Then I went to work for the BBC, as you've heard. Worked on their iPlayer. I was also one of the original people that worked on something called the Radio Player in the UK, which is now in many other countries across the world. And now, as you know, I'm working as a radio futurologist, working for a bunch of different companies across the world, and I run my own media information website as well. So today I'm going to talk around trends in radio across the world. In some of your programs it says I'm focusing on the UK. I know that the UK, being a Brit myself, I know that we did used to own the world, but I'm not going to focus on just the UK, you'll be glad to know. In case you haven't had enough graphs from Lee, I'm going to give you a few more. So that's something to look forward to, and some initials as well. But firstly, who best to ask about the future of radio than this guy? Does anybody know who this guy is? He is Britain's, or was Britain's foremost scientist. He discovered absolute zero. He invented the ship's compass. He was the first scientist to ever make it into the House of Lords in the UK. He was Lord Kelvin. And when somebody asked him about radio, Lord Kelvin said, "Radio has no future." So that just goes to show how wrong people can be. Mind you, he also said that aeroplanes are impossible and that X-rays are a hoax as well. So just goes to show how much he knew. But actually it's very difficult to work out what radio's future is going to be. This was the future in the 1930s. Radio was going to be used to print a newspaper. Not sure that that ever took off. This was it in the 1940s, the future of radio. We were all going to wander around with these beautiful hats on our head. The amazing new Man from Mars radio hat, complete with a review up there from Life magazine. Works fine. Not really a glowing review. But then, of course, things changed, and radio's life got much harder. In the 1950s, television came along. A massive threat for radio all of a sudden. This happened in the 70s.
新発明のウォークマン。縦、横、厚さ、カセットケースと同じ。
Boy or a girl? Anybody? I've got no idea. The Walkman was really scary for people in radio. It doesn't sound as if it could have been now. But all of a sudden you could walk around with your favourite music in your pocket, so why would you tune in to the radio? And as we know, radio continued to be very successful in the 1970s. Move forward to 2005, Wired magazine was having front covers like this, a bullet going through a radio saying that it was the end of radio. 5 years or so ago, Fox News, dreadful television channel, was saying that radio is dead. Is Apple iTunes next? Well, radio isn't dead. No, Apple iTunes is still very happy. Only last month, Salon, which is a dreadful website in the US, they were saying, is this now finally the end of the medium as a TV company in America has worked out that it has to sell its radio business to keep its TV company going. There's been no end of people trying to take our wonderful, there was a joke in there, I can't believe. There you go. Let's see if I can get my joke working. There's no end of people waiting to blow up the wonderful medium that we call radio. Not so much of a joke, I grant you, but nevertheless, worthwhile. But actually, as we know, radio is in tremendous health, as you've just heard. In the UK, 9 out of 10 people tune in every single week. In Brisbane, where I now live, 92.7% of people tune in. Canada, the US have the same kind of figures. And in Peninsular Malaysia, 97.2%, as you just heard. 97.2% now listen to the radio every single week. Radio is still a massive media. If you were running any other organisation, you would kill for figures like this. These are tremendous figures. So those of you with your smartphones, if you are one of the few that's brought a smartphone with you, this is the picture that you need to take and you need to share with people. Not the picture of a pie. No idea why this is clicking through. But this one, 97.2%, as we now know, of Malaysians are listening to the radio every single week. That is a tremendous figure. It's really high. Yet if you go out and you talk to people, they won't assume that radio is that big, because radio is invisible. But radio does a fantastic job of reaching a very large market. You heard Lee earlier on talking about share of audio, because radio is actually one of the most popular pieces of audio that we stick in our ears as well. And so here is a pie. chart showing you the amount of audio that we stick in people's ears. This is figures. These are figures from the UK. So, of all of the different pieces of audio that we put in people's ears, Spotify, our own MP3 collection, our CDs, 75%, nearly 76% of all of the things that we listen to is radio. Those are figures from the UK. Here are similar figures from the US. Obviously it's from the US because there was a picture of a very nasty burger. 61% of audio listening in the US is to live radio. Podcasts, by the way, only 2%. And in Australia, figures that came out only last week show that, again, the share of audio, you can probably guess, that radio is, again, one of the most tremendously popular pieces, with 68% of people tuning into live radio. And that staggering podcast figure, it's double anywhere else in the world at 4% of total audio that we put in people's ears. Live radio is still really, really large, and if you're an advertiser that wants to get your brand out to people, then live radio is clearly the way of doing it. And I think all of that is a pretty good sign in terms of where radio's headed, as is this, by the way. This is also a good sign. Thank you. So, what am I calling radio here when I'm talking about the future of radio? Because different people have different ideas of what radio is. I talk about radio being a shared experience, being a human connection. And you've seen from some of Lee's figures how people believe that, you know, radio is there to be that shared experience and to give them that companionship that they really need. That's what great radio is all about. 10 great songs in a row, not so much. But people who are talking, people who are there, sharing their experiences with you, you know, that's a really important part of radio's future. But the way that we listen to radio is changing. So let's have a look at how some people are tuning into radio. Radio is going multi-platform. There's a train-related joke here. Multi-platform. Thanks. I worked really hard at finding a picture of this. So, thank you very much. Yeah. Now I get a round of applause. So if you have a look at the UK, lots of different ways of tuning into radio in the UK. FM and AM, online, through the TV, through something called DAB, which is essentially a new way of broadcasting radio into a radio receiver. FM or AM only has 54% of radio listening in the UK. This is in terms of total hours. So lots of people are enjoying radio in lots of other different ways. Does anybody want to guess what's next? Let's do a show of hands for TV. So there's been quite a high figure from Astro, I noticed, in terms of tuning into radio over the TV. Who thinks that TV is the next most popular here? Show of hands. Okay. Who thinks that DAB radio is the next most popular here? 2 people's hands have gone up. Lee's hand went up. That might be a clue. And online and apps. Who thinks that online? Yeah, you see, everybody puts their hands up, and it's really interesting because online and apps is nowhere near as popular, actually, as we all like to think it is. The reality is that people are listening to radio on a radio receiver, and that is the most important part of radio, because that's the way that we're getting our audio to our consumers. So that's what's going on in the UK. It's actually slightly more complicated than that. Here are 2 radio stations which aren't on FM or AM at all in the UK. They are on all of those other platforms. Radio 6 Music is aimed at 40-year-olds, tall, slim, with a beard, good sense of humour, play very nice music. And as you'll notice, DAB has a large amount of listening to this particular station, with the internet having a smallish amount and TV even less. 1Extra is a radio station aimed at 15 to 20-year-olds. It plays urban music. It just sounds like a noise, lots of people shouting at each other. But when you have a look at how people are tuning into that radio station, that's very, very different. Lots of people tuning into radio over the TV. Why would that be? It's because actually we have younger people are more likely to have TVs in their bedroom rather than radios. But when they're doing their homework, they want to put the radio on, so they tune into a radio channel on the TV. So actually, when you're looking at radio's multi-platform future, it's a different multi-platform future depending on what type of content you're actually broadcasting.
Radioen digitaliseres. Du kan høre digitalradio via internett, digital-TV eller DAB+. Les mer om din nye radiohverdag på radio.no.
I bet that's the first time that Norwegian has ever been heard in this room. And that's where we are. Again, a lot of different ways of broadcasting radio in Norway. In fact, Norway is so excited about the future of radio that they're turning FM radio off next year. So you won't be able to get any radio stations on FM next year in Norway. It'll all be on DAB, the internet, and through the TV. And this is how radio listening has changed in Norway over the last 3 years or so. It's DAB now the most popular way of tuning in to radio. That's not to say that DAB is the future. It may not be in many cases. But that is to say that the way that we are listening to radio is changing. And that the radio industry is really good at adapting to this change and making our great content available on more and more platforms. But what the radio industry is also really good at doing around the world is using new platforms to be cleverer with content and to do new and innovative things with some of the audio. Let's go to South Africa. Whoa, let's go to South Africa. This is a radio station, this is a radio app run by Prime Media, who are based out of Johannesburg and Cape Town. And if you go to the 94.7 Highveld Stereo app, when the Oscar Pistorius trial was on a couple of years ago, what they did is they launched an additional radio station that you could tune into online, and it just contained the Oscar Pistorius trial. In fact, this is a bit of what it sounded like.
When you aren't listening to 94.7 Highveld Stereo, there's only one thing you really should listen to. Oscar Extra. Hit highveld.co.za. Catch special broadcasts covering the Oscar Pistorius murder trial with more of the latest updates from outside the courtroom to the bench, from the dock to the witness stand, with more on everything Oscar. Oscar Extra. You'll find it on highveld.co.za.
Because radio is now digital, that means that radio can do new and interesting things such as this. And yes, it was sponsored, and yes, it did really, really well in the audience figures. Here's another example in the UK. Magic is a radio station much like Light FM here in KL. It's a relaxing radio station. And what they did is they added an additional radio station called Magic ABBA. All it did is it played songs from ABBA. I can't think of anything worse. But nevertheless, the whole thing was sponsored by a show in London's West End, Mamma Mia, which of course contained music from ABBA. Really clever way of getting closer to an advertiser, and for that advertiser to do something really special on the air. NRJ, a set of radio stations in France, in Germany and in Canada, they have launched over 120 different online radio stations, including one radio station called NRJ Rihanna, which words fail me in terms of that. But they've added all of those additional radio stations and again offered those as sponsorship and as solus advertising, so that if you're a brand you can own some of this stuff. Really interesting. And here's something very clever out of the UK. So Absolute Radio is a radio station. It used to be Virgin Radio, where I used to work. It changed its name. It's now Absolute Radio, and it's a nationwide radio station. And they figured that they could have a real opportunity if they added some additional radio stations online and in the UK on DAB. And they took the main Absolute radio station and they thought, right, of all of the music that we play, let's also add a bunch of additional radio stations. So Absolute 80s only played music from the 1980s, Absolute 70s music from the 1970s, and so on. And they added all of these additional radio stations. And they did something very clever. They took the content that they had on the main radio stations. You see Jeff Lloyd's Home Time show there, starting at 5 in the afternoon. And they then added that same content on some of these radio stations later on. So you heard recordings of bits of those shows going on some of those other radio stations. Then what they did is they realised that their breakfast show, where they have a lot of sponsorship, a lot of competitions and stuff, they figured that on their breakfast show they could do something really clever. Their breakfast show goes out live across all of these 7 different radio stations. But whenever the presenter presses the button to start the next song, you hear a different song depending on what radio station you're in. And this gets more complicated because in the ad breaks, not only can you have different ad breaks on each of those radio stations, but also what was going on is if you listened online and you were signed in, then you got specific ad breaks aimed at you. So if you're a 40-year-old man, you got very different ads than if you were a 20-year-old girl. And I know that radio stations here are playing with in-stream as well. So what did that do to the main audience figures for the main Absolute radio station? Well, actually, it had very little effect to the audience figures for the main radio station, but they added essentially a whole extra radio station of total hours. So they could actually sell twice the amount of advertising, which is an amazing thing. And they ended up with the UK's largest commercial radio station on these new platforms, Absolute 80s, which has been a real success for them. And that's enabled brands to get much closer to their audiences in terms of being able to pick individual stations, but also Absolute Radio to increase the revenue that they own. And there are other examples of this kind of thing going on. LBC, which is a news radio station in the UK, has a radio station called LBC London News, which has the best of the interviews that you might have heard on LBC, that's also available on a DAB radio, as you can see there. And there's another example of that going on in Australia. News Talk Sport is a radio station which again takes some great interviews that have been broadcast on some of the radio stations that this organisation owns and gives them another airing on DAB and online. So radio stations are becoming cleverer in terms of some of the content that they're making and enabling people to actually get some great content out there. So the way that we in the radio industry are making radio is also changing as well. So this is a radio station that I spent 7 years of my life at, Radio Hallam. It was called Hallam FM when I was there. It's a radio station in Sheffield in the UK. And Radio Hallam was one of the original commercial radio stations in the UK, and it spent the equivalent of millions of dollars on their new radio studios. And they were beautiful radio studios, as you can see. But we don't really need that anymore. We don't need to spend millions and millions of dollars on radio stations. Here's a radio station based out of London called Fun Kids. And what Fun Kids is it's a kids radio station. It's available online and through its own app and so on and so forth. This is a radio station without any studios. It just uses a studio for a couple of hours a day and uses a clever playout system to exist all the way through the day. It's a 24-hour radio station, but it doesn't need studios all the time. So it's got a rack of equipment and everything else, but it doesn't need all of the expense of a brand new radio studio. That launched in 2009. If you have a look at 2010, here's a radio station actually in Indonesia in just one suitcase. So you can see the guy there with his CD player and his computer, two announcers there, and I wouldn't get too close to that red thing if I were you, because that's the transmitter. It's a thing that you can take to emergencies. Of course, radio is very, very good at keeping people up to date in case of emergencies. So you don't need massive, great big studio complexes anymore. 2013, a radio station in Oslo in Norway that just comes out of one computer with announcers uploaded into that one computer, and it just sits there and churns out some fantastic jazz music. And here's a radio station in a bucket. This is a place in Uganda, and it's a radio station which is literally in there. It's a smartphone in a bucket. It also contains a solar panel which is on the roof, and a transmitter which is also in there as well. The reason for the bucket, by the way, is to keep everything waterproof. The smartphone which is sitting there is very clever, because sometimes it plays programs it's already downloaded, and sometimes it links to live streams coming from elsewhere. By the way, you don't need a goat. The goat is just an additional extra if you fancy that. But where I see the future of radio, the long-term future of radio going, is that we'll be using these things rather more. Mobile phones. Because all of us own a mobile phone, and one of the clever things that we can do with mobile phones, of course, is that they're all personal. So we can begin to do some very clever personal things. And actually, we've already started.
This is NPR.
NPR One.
Listen up. You're listening to NPR.
NPR One.
This is a really interesting app, because I think this shows you where the future of radio might be headed. It's run by the American public radio company NPR. And the way that it works is quite simple. You start using this app, the first thing it does is it plays you the news bulletin. Because typically that's what people want. And then it starts going into individual news stories, both national and local. And it just sounds like a radio station. You let it go, and it plays lots and lots of bits of news and information that it thinks that you will be interested in. More to the point, you can actually teach it some of the stories that you'd be interested in, and some of the stories you wouldn't. So you might have a story about getting people to work harder, and then you might have a story about Greece's new government, and then a story about Islamic State fighters, and so on. You can mark stories as interesting, or you can skip through stories that you aren't interested in, and the app ends up learning what you like and learning what you don't like. It's something that I call atomization. It's taking a radio program and cutting it up into little parts, little component parts, and adding some information alongside that. So how's this working for NPR? Well, NPR is learning an awful lot out of this. Firstly, it's learning how to make those algorithms better to enable people to get more of the content they want and less of the content they don't. So just tweaking around with that algorithm has made people spend more than twice as long in that app, which is a great start. But secondly, they've taken the data from that app to allow them to understand what works and what doesn't in terms of radio. So actually it helps the journalists write better cues, it helps the journalists understand what stories are going to be more popular than others. So this app is actually making better radio for everybody, regardless of whether or not you end up using it. That's one way of personalisation. Here's another way of personalisation. Capital, very large radio station in the UK, have launched a new app that they call My Capital Extra. And My Capital Extra is an app where you can skip through some of the music that you don't like. It works a bit like this.
Welcome to My Capital Extra, where you're in control of the music. To get started, go to My Capital Extra in the menu, swipe left while listening to live radio, or hit the skip button on the play bar at the bottom of the screen. Once you're in My Capital Extra, you can see the next 8 songs we've got coming up for you. Not feeling a particular track? Simply swipe left to replace it with another big tune and line up your ultimate version of the Capital Extra playlist. In My Capital Extra, all your favourite DJs will still be bringing you the biggest music, news and gossip, but now it's interactive.
Tony Phillips with you, it is Capital Extra. Nice work, picking the tunes. I'm loving what you're doing. You know that...
So it's still got everything that's great about radio. It's still got the announcers on there. It's still got a great music choice, which has been curated by that radio station. But now you can personalise it even further. This is something that I call Lego bricking. I'm a radio consultant. I have to come up with stupid names, and this is one of mine. So the idea of Lego bricking is that you can take all of these individual pieces of radio content and you can make something that looks really, really good from those individual bits. I spent a long time building that in the hotel room last night, so I hope you like it. On demand, of course, is another part of radio's future. On demand, podcasts and things like that, and of course, there's nothing more on demand than some of the podcasts that I'll show you. Firstly, as you saw, the amount of podcast listening that's actually going on at the moment isn't that large. 2.9% in the UK is one of the figures, if you include catch-up radio in there as well. So you might ask, why bother with on-demand radio? Why bother with podcasting when everybody's tuned into live radio? Well, that is fair, but you should also have a look at when people are using live radio and on-demand radio, because actually it gets rather more interesting. This is a hideous graph, and I can only apologise for it. I mean, look at that. I mean, it's horrible, but I'm going to help you with it. What this graph is showing is people using different ways of getting radio to you. So this line here is live radio in the UK. This is how live radio works in the UK. So you have a nice peak at breakfast time. You have a nice peak as people are driving home through the rain, probably, it's the UK. And then it goes away again in the evening. So that's how live radio works. But here's how podcasting works. And you can see that podcasting is really interesting. There is an amount of people already who are commuting using podcasting in the morning. But there's also something that's really interesting. After about this kind of time, after about 5:30 at night, you can see that the amount of people who are using podcasts are about half the amount of people who are using live radio. And actually it gets closer and closer and closer as you go on in the evening. Podcasts actually get to people at different times of the day than live radio does, which is really interesting. And podcasts also get to people when they've got the time to really, really concentrate. So what many radio stations are doing across the world is they're actually producing additional content for podcasting, where they can actually go much deeper into your brands, into what you do, into what your company is capable of offering. And enabling audiences who are interested in your brand already to actually find out much more information. So podcasting, although it is small, it is a real, real opportunity. And who better to make podcasts than people who understand how to make great radio stations.
It is the internet sensation that has captured the imagination of millions. Apple calls Serial the most popular podcast in the world. It's a real-life crime story about a 15-year-old murder case. The series is raising new questions about this investigation.
There's a great reporter here that I'd like you to watch.
Behind the podcast. Jan, I've been hearing so much about it. Good morning.
Well, good morning. It's being called a pop culture obsession. You can't watch it on TV or Netflix. You actually can't watch it anywhere. It's kind of like the old days of radio.
Cheers, Jan. Thanks for that. Serial, of course, any radio conference can't, it's now the law that any radio conference has to mention Serial at least once. So I've taken that hit. Thank you very much. But Serial is, as you know, massive. It was a tremendously popular podcast when it first came out, and it did tremendous figures as well. One of the really interesting things about Serial is the type of community that it actually got going online, of people who are tuning in to Serial. This is a video of a listener to Serial who is driving from the high school to the Best Buy where apparently the lady was murdered, and then to somewhere else. And he's doing this just to check the timings, because the journalist in Serial checks the timings first. And so he's doing it just to check that the journalist was telling the truth. I mean, this is heavy stuff. But Serial did some tremendous figures, some really, really good download figures. Over 100 million I'm pressing my marvellous button, there you go, over 100 million downloads have happened for Serial so far. But here's the thing that isn't talked about that often. 3/4 of these downloads were actually done after Serial had finished. So archives are really important. Archives are a really good, important part of radio. And while radio's strength is live, actually what the internet's strength is all of that archive stuff, is keeping stuff online so you can go back and enjoy that later. And that's why actually online and live radio work so well together. Live radio is great for emotion, it's great for immediacy. The internet is great for permanency, it's great for detail, it's great for data capture as well. And that's why the canny marketer uses both radio and online together. Finally, let's very quickly talk about visualizing radio, making radio prettier with images. Here's something from Lee's homeland of Scotland, and a piece of very early visualization from the BBC.
It's 7 o'clock on Monday, the 1st of December. This is Good Morning Scotland with Neville Garden and Malcolm Wilson.
And to celebrate 50 years of broadcasting from these studios here in Edinburgh, we welcome you in sound and in pictures for a unique experiment combining radio and television.
This is Radio Vision, and if you haven't yet done so, now's the time to turn on your television set to BBC One.
And in today's programme, the new boss of the Scottish Development Agency and the job he's got ahead of him.
A report calling for a major rethink on transport in Scotland.
An assessment of the trial of the Gang of Four by a man just back from...
So adding visuals to images isn't necessarily anything new. Radio Scotland was doing that in, that was only last week, obviously, as you could tell. No, that was in 1980. Here's a piece from a couple of years ago in Sydney, in Australia.
It's a history-making day for us here at KISS FM. It is a brand new radio station, and we have got a jam-packed show. I think we're starting right now.
Let's do it.
Muck around. Welcome, everyone. Morning.
Right, now I'm going to do an experiment here. This is great audio, by the way. Fantastic audio. But can we just turn the audio off, just for a second? And now let's just watch this. Some really good audio going on. Any minute now, Jackie will grab a little bit of water. Go on, Jackie. Go on, Jackie. Oh no, scratch the nose first. It's exciting, this, isn't it? And this is what some radio stations have trouble with, is actually making some great visualised content. Because they'll put a camera on top of the in the studio, and they'll assume that that's all that they really need. The good news is that radio stations are getting brighter and cleverer about some of the visualisation that they end up doing. Let's turn the audio back on and show you this. This is a very small radio station. It's based out of Cornwall in the UK, which is miles away from anywhere. And it's a tiny little radio station, but what they're doing is they're producing something which is a really good piece of daily visualisation that they make every single morning.
Kristen Hunkett with the stories trending at piratefm.co.uk. In just a sec, the Cornish Wildlife Sanctuary picking up penguins. But first, Cornish school children are preparing to boldly go where no one has gone before. The Eden Project is one of 20 science centres putting on a...
So some really nice piece of visual content there, with some great advertising in it, some great sponsorship in there and everything else. They share that on Facebook, they share that on Twitter. Of course, I haven't mentioned social media because you folks are just as good at it as any other country in the world. But they've done tremendously well in terms of that. The canny way that people are using visualization now is they're actually recording what goes on in the studio just in case it's good enough for them to share later. So just sit there with a couple of cameras, automated cameras that flick in between, following where the audio is coming from, and working out, is there something amusing, is there something good that we can actually show our audience, that we can share with our TV networks? Is there some really clever stuff? So here's an example of that. Does anybody know who Boris Johnson is? Boris Johnson used to be the London Mayor. He's now the UK Foreign Secretary. Good grief. But he's an interesting character. Now, if you're the London Mayor, you are in charge of the subway, okay? You should know how much the subway costs. You should know how much the subway costs if you pay by cash. You should know how much the subway costs if you pay by the payment card, which in the UK is called an Oyster card. You should probably know that. And so when he was asked on the LBC Breakfast Show how much a subway ticket would cost, you'd have thought that he should have a pretty instant response. If you... And there's my instant response. You know when people say, why don't you use our clicker, James, instead of yours? And you say, no, I'll use my clicker. I should listen to those people next time. Here we go.
If you were, you're telling us the London Underground is good value. If you were to go to your nearby station and buy a one-way ticket, Angel, to London Bridge, which of course would be close to your place of work, how much would it cost you to travel one way, Angel, to London Bridge? On a, what,
this is our mayor.
Oyster card? No, just a one-off trip. You've forgotten your Oyster. Angel to London Bridge. How much is that going to cost you?
I've got the figures here. I've got the. If you get a.
I don't know what you're finding difficult about this. You're quite a well-educated man. You present yourself at Angel Station. You want to go to London Bridge. You haven't got your Oyster. What else do you need to know? Ticket seller's name.
Yeah. If you've got your Oyster card, I think it's gone up to £2.
£2?
£2.10. I use the Oyster card because it's the cheapest way of getting it.
It's in your suit that my wife has sent to the cleaners.
I always use it.
How much is the fare?
Always use your Oyster card. I can give you. Do you want me to recite? So I'll give you. Here we go. Here's a whole list. Here we go. Okay.
Even I do this.
Here we go.
And I don't use the things.
If you want a one-way.
Oh dear. I'm just going to put it. I'll put him out of his misery. I mean, crikey. But isn't that a fantastic piece of video? And it's a fantastic piece of video that the radio station thought, well, we're going to have that, we're going to share that. That made the evening news, because of course it was just great. Loads of people shared that online and so on and so forth. What LBC have now done is they've really spent on their radio studios to make it look even better when they're sharing video, as you move forward. So finally, let me skip past this little piece of video. Finally, let me just say, firstly, don't believe anybody that says that radio is dying. It clearly isn't. As we've heard today, 97.2% of people in Malaysia tuning in to the radio every single week. The way that we're tuning in is changing, and that actually gives everybody in this room, for all of the brands that you look after, great opportunities in the future. And the way that we make radio is changing as well, which again gives us fantastic opportunities too. So what is the future of radio? Well, I think the future of radio is three things. It's content, making sure that the content is absolutely right, is well targeted to the audiences that we want to get. It's using the right technology, making sure that our radio stations are available on the platforms that people expect, whether that's through the TV, whether that's online, through different apps, or whether that's, of course, through broadcast radio. But also it's getting the user experience right. It's making sure that people can actually find our radio station, can tune into our radio station, and enjoy our radio station. But I think if we get all of that right, if we get the technology right, the user experience right, and most of all the content right, then we'll have something to smile about. Our advertisers will all smile, our radio stations will all smile, and our listeners will all smile. And smiling is a great place to be. So thank you for your time today. I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you, James. As usual, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Are there any questions from the floor?
I've got a very good newsletter. It's very good. It's free. You should get it. There's a question. Do you just want
There's a mic.
for the microphone, because otherwise I can hear you, but nobody else can.
James, thank you. That's a fantastic talk. But if I can just share an observation and an experiment which I tried in England and succeeded as a media strategist. A seed which I picked up in my planning days in India. One of the areas where radio is severely undermarketed is because people do not understand the value and impact it has on stocking levels at the lower, smaller retail level. And if you travel around India, the street corner pawn shop who sells little things, he listens to radio all the time. Now, Unilever, Hindustan Lever, Unilever, and ITC have got fantastic studies on it. In England, about 16 years ago, you know the Sunrise radio station, which operates out of Southall, targeting the subcontinental market. And every corner store in southern England is owned by a Shah or a Patel. Now, if you play games, I played an experiment 16 years ago for 2 FMCG marketers. Huge impact on stockings at all the Shah and Patel stores. And I've tried that with data in Indonesia also. So that is one area where radio marketers do not see the value that it can have tremendous impact on stocking levels at the small item retail market. Because all radio marketing documents I see are targeted showing the end consumer. We have so many listeners. This is but the stocking levels at the FMCG products, phenomenal impact for radio.
I think you're right, and I think it's very, because radio is by and large invisible, it's very easy for advertising planners to forget about how successful radio can be, and to forget just the sheer power of radio. And actually, when you go in our homes, our chairs are sat round this great big flat screen television. That's the focus of our front room. Is this beautiful TV, and the radios, because we listen to radio in a much more intimate way, the radios are hidden. They're hidden in our bedrooms, in our bathrooms, in the car. And I think that radio's invisibility is its real strength, because it is there, and it's there for everybody who's tuning in. It is the best medium by a long way for advertising things that you are going to buy from the shops. Because it's the medium that people tune into as they're driving to those shops, as they're on the bus to those shops. It's the last medium that they hear before they make their purchases. It's a fantastic, fantastic medium. And I think it's very easy, because radio is so invisible, it's very easy to forget how popular radio is and how much of a difference it can actually make. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, indeed.
Hello, James. Just a small question.
Yeah.
How long do you stay here?
How long am I staying here?
Yes.
Is this a threat?
How long will you stay here so we can use and enjoy your information?
I'm going tomorrow afternoon. So there's a very good boot camp tomorrow. How many people are coming to boot camp tomorrow? Just as a show of hands to see how many slides I can reuse. Good, that's okay.
Thank you.
So I'm around, but my contact details are up there. And Indonesia isn't as far away as Malaysia. What country am I in today? Malaysia isn't as far away from Australia, where I now live, as many other places are. So yeah.
Sorry, is there a question?
I think there was.
There was?
When are you leaving? That was what the question was. I've never been asked that before. Get out. Is there one more question? Or can I sit down and have a rest now?
Okay. So just your name, where you're from, and your question.
Okay, sure. Hi, James. I'm Karen from Star Media Group. I would love to hear your thoughts on programmatic radio advertising. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that programmatic radio advertising is really interesting. So programmatic radio advertising, a very simple, straightforward way to help brands buy advertising that really gets in front of their target audience. I also think that it's not necessarily just something for online. I know that there are radio companies here in Malaysia who are using programmatic, they're using in-stream, very targeted ads if you're tuning in online. But actually, it's also for use on the air as well. And there's a lot of radio companies, particularly in the US and in the UK, who are using programmatics to help them with some of their inventory. So, you know, if you've got 12,000 radio stations as you do in the US, or 600 radio stations as you do in the UK, it gets really hard to plan and buy radio. So anything that makes radio easier to buy, you know, is a really good thing. The one thing I would say about it is that it's fine if you want to buy spots. Radio works really well if you don't just buy spots. If you buy other things as well, if you buy sponsorship, which is a great brand builder, if you buy competitions and stuff, if you buy other things that also go on over the air. So it probably doesn't replace the standard way that we have of talking to individual stations and understanding how they can best work with a specific brand. But I think programmatic is a very interesting step forward in terms of advertising planning.
Right, James is still going to be around. There's going to be a panel session up next, so we'll get you to stay up, and I'll get the team to set up the stools as I invite everyone else up here. So thank you again, James.
Thank you very much.